The gunshot cracked through the mountain darkness like thunder, and Caleb Stone's hand was already on his Colt before the echo faded into the pines. He had been tracking the Rustlers for 3 days across the Wyoming territory, following their trail from his modest ranch at the base of the Bighorn Mountains, where they had made off with 15 head of his cattle in the dead of night. It was early September of 1878, and the autumn air already carried the sharp bite of winter to come. Caleb had built his life in these mountains over the past 5 years, carving out an existence from the unforgiving wilderness, with nothing but his own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to be beaten by the land, or any man who tried to take what was his. The Rustlers had been sloppy, leaving a trail even a greenhorn could follow, but they had the advantage of numbers and a head start. Caleb was one man, but he was a man who had survived 2 brutal winters alone in a snow-buried cabin, who had fought off a grizzly with nothing but a hunting knife, and who knew these mountains like other men knew their own parlors. His broad shoulders and thick arms, built from years of felling trees and breaking horses, made him look more bear than man in the dim light filtering through the forest canopy. His dark hair fell past his collar, tied back with a strip of leather, and his beard was trimmed close to his strong jaw. At 28 years old, he was in his prime, all muscle and determination wrapped in worn buckskin and denim. Now, crouched behind a boulder in the darkness, Caleb watched the Rustlers' camp below. They had stopped in a small clearing, confident enough in their escape to build a fire. 3 men sat around the flames, passing a bottle between them and laughing. His cattle were penned in a makeshift corral of rope strung between trees. But what caught Caleb's attention and sent ice through his veins was the 4th figure tied to a tree at the edge of the firelight. A woman. She sat with her back against the rough bark, her hands bound behind her, her dark hair tangled around her shoulders. Even from this distance, Caleb could see the defiant set of her jaw, the way she held herself rigid despite her obvious exhaustion. She wore the practical clothes of a frontier woman, a simple dress now torn and dusty, and boots that had seen hard use. As he watched, one of the Rustlers, a thin man with a cruel face, walked over and said something to her that made the others laugh. The woman spat at his feet. The Rustler's hand came up fast, and Caleb saw her head snap to the side from the blow. Something dark and violent unfurled in his chest, something that went beyond simple justice for stolen cattle. He had seen too much cruelty in his years on the frontier, too much casual brutality toward those who could not defend themselves. He had left civilization partly because he was tired of watching powerful men abuse their strength, tired of the ugliness that seemed to follow wherever people gathered in numbers. But here in the wilderness, far from any law or town, he could not simply walk away. Caleb studied the camp with a tactical eye honed by years of hunting and warfare. He had served in the cavalry during the Indian Wars, before mustering out and heading deeper into the mountains to find some kind of peace. The skills he had learned had never left him, even if the desire to use them had. The 3 Rustlers were confident, drunk, and careless. They had posted no watch, assuming they had left any pursuit far behind. Their rifles leaned against a log near the fire, within reach but not in hand. The clearing was surrounded by thick forest on 3 sides, with a steep drop-off on the 4th where a creek cut through the rocks below. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, giving him the cover of darkness. He moved like a shadow through the trees, his moccasins silent on the forest floor. Years of living alone had taught him patience, how to move with the rhythms of the wild, how to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder in it. He circled around to approach from behind the woman, using the darkness and the distraction of the fire to mask his movements. The Rustlers were arguing now about something, their voices raised and slurred. Perfect. Caleb was 10 feet from the woman when her head turned slightly, and he knew she had sensed him. To her credit, she did not cry out or make any sudden movement that would alert her captors. Instead, she remained perfectly still, only her eyes moving to track his approach. In the faint light, he could see those eyes were a startling green, sharp with intelligence and something else. Not fear, determination. He put a finger to his lips and moved behind the tree. His knife was in his hand, the blade catching a glint of firelight as he sawed quickly through the ropes binding her wrists. The moment she was free, he pressed the knife's handle into her palm and leaned close to whisper directly into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. Stay down and stay quiet. When the shooting starts, run for the trees to the east. Follow the creek downstream until you find a big lightning-struck pine. Wait for me there. She nodded once, her fingers closing around the knife handle with a grip that spoke of familiarity. Not some helpless town lady, then. Good. That would make this easier. Caleb moved back into the darkness, positioning himself behind a thick ponderosa pine with a clear view of the camp. His rifle was already in his hands, a Winchester 1873 that he had spent countless hours learning to shoot with the kind of accuracy that came from the hunting game that would not give you a second chance. He took a breath, steadied himself, and then spoke loudly into the night. You men took something that belongs to me. I am giving you one chance to ride out of here and leave the cattle and the woman. The effect was instantaneous. All three rustlers lurched to their feet, grabbing for their weapons in drunken panic. But they were looking toward the voice, toward the wrong direction, confused by the darkness and the echo of sound through the trees. "Who is out there?" the biggest one shouted, a bear-like man with a bushy beard. "Show yourself." "I am the man whose cattle you stole," Caleb called back, already moving to a new position. "Never stay where you fired or spoke. Basic tactics. And I am the man who's going to kill you if you do not drop your guns and walk away right now." The thin, cruel-faced one laughed, though it sounded nervous. "You hear that, boys? One man thinks he can take all three of us. You are a fool, mister. We will find you in these trees and skin you alive." "Last warning," Caleb said, and his voice had gone cold and flat, the voice of a man who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation if pressed. "Drop your guns." Instead, the third rustler, a young man who could not have been more than 20, fired wildly into the darkness, his pistol barking flame and thunder. The shot went nowhere near Caleb, but it ended any chance of a peaceful resolution. The woman, smart as she had seemed, was already moving, darting toward the eastern trees in a low crouch. One of the rustlers spotted her and turned to give chase. Caleb's rifle spoke once, a sharp crack that echoed through the mountains. The rustler chasing the woman went down hard, clutching his leg and screaming. Not a killing shot, but one that would keep him down and out of the fight. Caleb did not enjoy killing, even men who deserved it, and he would give them whatever mercy the situation allowed. But mercy had its limits. The big bearded rustler was firing now too, pumping shots from his rifle in the general direction of Caleb's muzzle flash. Wood splintered from the tree beside Caleb's head, and he dropped flat, rolling to new cover. The darkness was both his ally and his enemy, making it hard to see but harder to be seen. He came up behind a deadfall log and sighted carefully. The thin, cruel-faced man was trying to rally the others, shouting orders and pointing toward where he thought Caleb might be. He was the leader then, the most dangerous because he had kept his head. Caleb tracked him as he moved, waiting for a clear shot. The firelight created a zone of visibility, and the moment the thin man stepped into it fully, Caleb squeezed the trigger. The man went down without a sound, and Caleb knew from the way he fell that the shot had been fatal. No suffering. Quick. That was as much mercy as he could offer to a man who had struck a bound woman. 2 down, 1 still dangerous. The young rustler was panicking now, firing his pistol randomly into the darkness, the shots coming fast and wild. He was going to get himself killed through pure stupidity. Caleb could hear him shouting, cursing, on the edge of breaking completely. The bearded man was trying to calm him, but his voice was tight with fear too. They could not see their enemy, could not fight what they could not find, and the darkness pressed in around them with suffocating weight. "Give it up!" Caleb called from yet another position. "Your friend is dead. The other is not walking anywhere soon. Put your guns down, and you can leave here alive." "The hell with you!" the young one screamed and fired again toward the voice. Caleb sighed. Some men could not be reasoned with, especially when fear had them. He moved swiftly through the trees, using the noise of the young rustlers shooting to mask his approach. He came at them from the side now, from an angle they would not expect, and when he stepped into the edge of the firelight, he had his rifle leveled and his voice steady. "Drop them, now." The bearded man turned, tried to bring his weapon around, but froze when he saw the absolute certainty in Caleb's eyes. The Winchester was pointed directly at his chest, and at this range, there would be no missing. Slowly, the big man lowered his rifle and let it fall to the ground. The young rustler, however, was too far gone in his panic. He spun toward Caleb, his pistol rising, his finger already squeezing the trigger. Caleb moved on pure instinct, diving sideways as the shot cracked past his ear, so close he felt the heat of it. He hit the ground rolling and came up firing. The young rustler staggered back, his pistol falling from nerveless fingers, and collapsed near the fire. Caleb rose slowly, his rifle trained on the bearded man, who had his hands raised high and was shaking his head frantically. "I am done. I am done," the big man said, his voice breaking. "Do not shoot me, mister. I give up." "Sit down and do not move," Caleb ordered, and the man obeyed immediately, sinking to the ground with his hands still raised. Caleb moved quickly to check the other two rustlers. The thin one was dead, as he had known he would be. The young one was breathing shallowly, gut-shot and dying. There was nothing Caleb could do for him, not out here with no doctor and no supplies. The man he had shot in the leg was conscious and groaning, clutching the wound but still alive. Survivable if he got medical attention soon. "You got a wagon or horses nearby?" Caleb asked the bearded rustler. "Horses, tied up over there." The man pointed toward the trees with a trembling hand. "You're going to load your friends on those horses, the living ones anyway, and you're going to ride hard for the nearest town. You tell the law exactly what happened here. You tell them you tried to steal my cattle and took a woman hostage, and I came to get them back. You understand?" "Yes, sir," the man said quickly. "We are sorry. We are real sorry. We did not mean no harm to the woman. We just found her on the road and thought—" "I do not care what you thought," Caleb cut him off coldly. "You put hands on a woman in anger. You are lucky I am letting you live at all. Now move." The bearded man scrambled to obey, and Caleb watched him carefully as he gathered the injured rustler and managed to get both him and the dying young man draped over their horses. The young one died before they even got him secured, and the bearded rustler looked at Caleb with pleading eyes. "Just go," Caleb said, suddenly tired. "Get out of my sight." They left at a stumbling run, the bearded man leading the horses with their grim cargo through the darkness. Caleb listened until the sound of their passage faded completely, then turned to survey the camp. The fire was burning low. The dead rustler lay where he had fallen. Caleb's cattle were still penned in their makeshift corral, shifting nervously at the smell of blood and gunpowder. And somewhere in the darkness, a woman was waiting. He took a moment to catch his breath, to let the battle tension drain from his muscles. His hands were steady, they always were in a fight, but now he could feel the slight tremor of aftermath. He had killed a man tonight. It never got easier, no matter how justified. He said a brief prayer for the dead, even the ones who had probably not deserved it, then kicked dirt over the fire until only embers remained. Caleb found the lightning-struck pine easily, following the creek downstream just as he had told the woman to do. She was there, standing with her back to the massive scarred tree, the knife he had given her held ready in her hand. When she saw him emerge from the darkness, she lowered the blade but did not sheath it. "It is over," he said quietly. "They are gone." She studied him in the faint moonlight, and he studied her right back. Now that he could see her more clearly, he realized she was younger than he had first thought, probably around 24 or 25. Her face was fine-boned and striking rather than conventionally pretty, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that spoke of determination. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders where it had escaped from what had probably been a neat bun earlier in the day. But it was her eyes that caught him, those sharp green eyes that seemed to see right through to his bones. "You killed them?" she asked, and her voice was steady, neither shocked nor pleased, just seeking information. "One dead, one dying. I let the other two go to get medical help and report to the law." He paused. "The dead one was the one who hit you." Something flickered across her face, too quick to identify. "I see. Thank you for that, though I did not need avenging particularly. Just rescuing." "I did not do it for revenge," Caleb said, though that was not entirely true. "He did not give me a choice." She nodded slowly, then held out the knife handle first. "I suppose this is yours. Keep it for now. It is a long walk back to civilization, and you might need it." He gestured toward the direction of the camp. "I have cattle to move and a dead man to bury. I will escort you wherever you were heading after I am done." "I can help," she said immediately. "I know cattle. I grew up on a ranch." Caleb raised an eyebrow. You have had a hard day already. Miss, I can manage. Her eyes flashed with something that might have been irritation. I have had hard days before, and I said I can help. I would rather be doing something useful than sitting here dwelling on what just happened. He could understand that. Action was often better than thought when it came to processing violence. All right then, what is your name? Eleanor Marsh. Most people call me Ellie. She stuck out her hand like a man would. Caleb took it, noting the strength in her grip and the calluses on her palm. Ranch girl indeed. Caleb Stone. Most people call me Stone, or Mountain Man when they are talking behind my back. A slight smile touched her lips, the first he had seen. I wonder why. Do you live on a mountain? In one, more like. I have a cabin and some land at the base of the Bighorns. He released her hand, suddenly aware that he had held it a moment longer than necessary. Come on, we have work to do before dawn. They walked back to the camp together, and Caleb found himself oddly aware of her presence beside him. She moved quietly and surely through the darkness, not stumbling or needing guidance, and she did not chatter nervously to fill the silence. She had been through something terrible today, had been struck and tied up and threatened, yet she was not falling apart or demanding coddling. There was steel in Eleanor Marsh, the kind that came from genuine strength rather than bravado. It took them most of the night to break down the Rustlers' camp, bury the dead man in a shallow grave marked with stones, and get Caleb's cattle organized for travel. Ellie worked without complaint, helping to gather the scattered supplies and calm the nervous cattle with a gentle hand and a soft voice. She knew her way around livestock, that was clear, and she was not afraid of hard work. By the time the first gray light of dawn was touching the eastern sky, they had everything ready. Caleb had found the Rustlers' supply wagon hidden further up the trail, and he hitched a couple of their horses to it. His own horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Sam, he had left tied a mile back when he had approached the Rustlers' camp on foot. They would pick him up on the way. So where were you heading when those men took you? Caleb asked as they started down the mountain trail, the cattle moving ahead of them in a loose group. He walked beside the wagon where Ellie sat on the driving bench, and she handled the reins with easy competence. Red Lodge, she said, naming a town about 30 miles northeast of their current position. I was traveling from my family's ranch in Montana to meet my brother. He has a claim near Red Lodge and wanted me to come help him establish it before winter. Her voice tightened slightly. I was stupid. I left Billings on my own, thinking the road was safe enough, and those men overtook me yesterday afternoon. They took my horse and my supplies and seemed to think I would be entertaining company for their camp. That was not stupid, Caleb said firmly. That was them being criminals. You could not have known. I could have been more careful, could have waited for a group to travel with. She shook her head. My father always said my independence would get me in trouble one day. Independence is not a fault, Miss Marsh. It is just a quality that requires the right circumstances. Caleb looked up at her, noting the tired lines around her eyes and the bruise blooming on her cheek where the rustler had struck her. How old is your brother? 22, 2 years younger than me. She glanced down at him with a wry smile. And before you ask, yes, my parents think it is shameful that I am not married at my advanced age of 24. That is part of why I'm heading to Red Lodge, to give them a break from worrying about me and to help Daniel get established so he can send money home. 24 is not advanced, Caleb said, amused despite himself. I am 28 and unmarried. I suppose people say the same about me. Do they? Have long conversations about the tragic spinster mountain man who lives alone in the wilderness? Her tone was teasing, lighter now that they were away from the scene of violence and moving toward safety. I do not know. I am usually too far from people to hear what they say. He smiled up at her, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Anyway, we will get you to Red Lodge and your brother. It will take a few days with the cattle, but the weather is holding clear. I appreciate it, Mr. Stone, truly. Her voice went soft and sincere. What you did back there, coming after those men alone in the dark, that took courage. I will not forget it. Caleb felt heat rise in his face and was glad for the dim light that hid it. He was not used to gratitude or to being around people at all, really. He had chosen his solitary life deliberately, seeking the peace and simplicity of the mountains after too many years of noise and blood and complication. But now, Walking beside this capable, sharp-eyed woman in the early morning light, he found he did not mind the company as much as he would have expected. "Anyone would have done the same," he said gruffly. "No," Ellie said quietly. "They would not have. Most people would have taken their cattle and left me to my fate. That is just the way of things out here. You chose differently, and that matters." He did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and kept walking. They traveled together for 3 days across the high country, following old trails that wound through pine forests and alpine meadows. Caleb knew this land intimately, knew where to find water and good grazing for the cattle, knew which passes were clear and which would be treacherous. He led them by the safest routes, and Ellie followed without question, trusting his guidance. At night they made camp, and Caleb tried to give her as much privacy as the wilderness allowed. He strung up a tarp to create a separate sleeping area for her and kept the fire burning bright to ward off any predators. Not that he expected trouble. They were well into settled territory now, and the most dangerous animals for miles were human, and those they had already dealt with. Ellie proved to be excellent company around the campfire. She was educated, had gone to a school for girls back east before returning to help on her family's ranch, and she had opinions on everything from politics to poetry. Caleb, who had spent years with only his own thoughts for conversation, found himself drawn into discussions that ranged far and wide. She challenged him, questioned his assumptions, made him think in ways he had not bothered to in a long time. "So why do you live alone up in the mountains?" she asked on the second night, as they sat watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast, dark sky. "You do not seem like a man who hates people particularly, just a man who's avoiding them." Caleb poked at the fire with a stick, considering his answer. "I was in the cavalry for 5 years, he said finally. "Fought in the Indian Wars down in the Arizona Territory and up into Montana. Saw things that I did not agree with. Did things I am not proud of. When my enlistment was up, I just wanted to get as far from orders and officers and armies as I could. I wanted to be somewhere clean." "And are you?" Ellie asked softly. "Clean? I do not know," he admitted, "but I am quieter. The mountains do not ask anything of me except to respect them. They do not care about my past or my sins. That is worth something." "It must be lonely, though." "Sometimes," Caleb agreed. "But loneliness is better than being surrounded by people and still feeling alone. That is what the cavalry was like near the end. Thousands of men, and I had never felt so isolated." Ellie nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "I think I understand that. I have felt that way at church socials and barn dances, all those people chattering around me and not one of them actually seeing me. Just seeing a spinster ranch girl who should be more interested in finding a husband than in reading books or having opinions." "Their loss," Caleb said, and meant it. "You are worth 10 of any empty-headed society girl." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them in the firelight, something unspoken but real, a connection forming like a rope being twisted from separate strands. Caleb felt it in his chest, a tightness that was not entirely comfortable but not unwelcome either. "Thank you," Ellie said quietly. "That is kind of you to say." "It is true," Caleb replied, holding her gaze. "Not kind, just true." The moment stretched out, warm and charged, until a log shifted in the fire and sent up a shower of sparks. They both looked away, but Caleb could feel the echo of that connection still humming between them. On the third day, they reached the outskirts of Red Lodge just as the afternoon sun was slanting low and golden across the valley. The town was small but growing, one of the many settlements that had sprung up to service the miners and ranchers pushing into the Montana Territory. Caleb directed the cattle toward the holding pens at the edge of town, while Ellie asked directions to her brother's claim. Daniel Marsh's land was about 2 miles south of the main settlement, 160 acres of grassland with a small creek running through it. The cabin was half-built, just 4 walls and a roof so far, and Daniel himself was a young man who looked like a slightly softer version of his sister. Same dark hair, same green eyes, but where Ellie was all steel and determination, Daniel had a gentler air about him. He came running when he saw the wagon approaching, his face splitting into a huge grin. "Ellie, thank God, I was starting to worry. You are 3 days late." He pulled her down from the wagon bench into a tight hug, then noticed Caleb and the cattle. "What is all this? Where's your horse?" Ellie explained quickly what had happened, and Caleb watched Daniel's face cycle through shock, anger, and then fierce protectiveness. When she finished, the young man turned to Caleb and stuck out his hand. "Mr. Stone, I owe you a debt I can never repay. My sister is everything to me, and if those men had—" He could not finish the sentence, his voice choking. "Thank you, truly." Caleb shook his hand. "No debt. I was getting my cattle back anyway. Your sister just happened to be there." "He is being modest," Ellie said dryly. "He could have taken his cattle and left me tied to that tree. He chose not to." "Then I owe you even more." Daniel looked at the cattle, then back at Caleb. "Are you planning to drive those back to your ranch? That is a long trip. Why do you not sell them here? I know a man who is buying cattle for the mining camps up in the mountains." Caleb considered. It was a long trip back, and he had not been looking forward to making it alone. With Ellie safely delivered to her brother, his job was done. He could sell the cattle, restock his supplies, and head home. It made sense, but it also meant saying goodbye to Ellie, and he found himself strangely reluctant to do that. "That might work," he said slowly, "if the price is fair." "Oh, it will be. Let me introduce you tomorrow. Tonight you will stay for dinner at least. It is the least we can do." Daniel was already leading them toward the cabin, talking a mile a minute about his plans for the land and the crops he hoped to plant. Caleb opened his mouth to decline, to make an excuse about needing to get back, but Ellie caught his eye and smiled. It was the kind of smile that made his chest feel tight again, warm and genuine, and somehow challenging all at once. "Yes, Mr. Stone," she said. "Please stay. I make a decent stew, even on a campfire. And Daniel is a terrible cook. You would be saving me from whatever he was planning to serve." "Hey," Daniel protested, but he was laughing. "It is not my fault I never learned. You always did the cooking at home." So Caleb stayed. Dinner was indeed a good stew, made from supplies Daniel had on hand and seasoned with wild herbs Ellie gathered from along the creek. They ate sitting on logs around the fire, and the conversation flowed easy and comfortable. Daniel told stories about growing up on the ranch, and Ellie chimed in with corrections and her own versions of events. Caleb found himself laughing more than he had in years, drawn into their warmth and their obvious affection for each other. When the moon was high and the fire burning low, Daniel excused himself to bed. The cabin had only one room so far, and he strung up a blanket to give himself some privacy, leaving Caleb and Ellie alone by the fire. "He likes you," Ellie said, staring into the flames. "Daniel is a good judge of character. If he did not, you would know." "I like him too," Caleb said honestly. "He is a good kid. This land will treat him well if he's willing to work for it." "He is willing. We both learned hard work early." She glanced at him, her face half in shadow. "What about you, Caleb? What will you do now? Go back to your mountain and your cabin?" "That was the plan," Caleb said. "It is what I do. I live alone, I keep to myself. It is a simple life." "But is it a happy one?" Ellie asked, and there was no judgment in her voice, just curiosity. Caleb thought about that, really thought about it. Was he happy? He was content, certainly. He had everything he needed and the peace he had sought. But happiness, that was something different. Happiness required more than just absence of pain. It required presence of joy, of connection, of purpose beyond simple survival. "I do not know," he admitted. "I've not thought about happiness in a long time. I was just focused on getting through each day, each season, surviving." "That is existing," Ellie said softly. "Not living." "Maybe," Caleb agreed, "but it is safe. Living, really living, that requires risk, requires putting yourself out there to be hurt. I had enough of that in the war." Ellie was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think you are wrong. I think you took a huge risk 3 nights ago when you came after those rustlers. And I think you are taking a risk right now, sitting here with me, letting me see past your walls. You are braver than you give yourself credit for, Caleb Stone." He looked at her then, really looked at her and saw the truth in her eyes. She saw him, not the mountain man, not the soldier, not the loner. Just him, Caleb, with all his scars and fears and desperate desire for something he could not quite name. And she was not afraid of what she saw. "Ellie," he started, but did not know how to continue. She smiled, and it was sad and sweet at the same time. "I know. You are going back to your mountain, and I'm staying here with Daniel. We both have our paths, but I want you to know that these 3 days, they have meant something to me. You have meant something to me. I will not forget you." "I will not forget you either," Caleb said, and his voice was rough with an emotion he could not quite identify. "You are like no one I have ever met, Eleanor Marsh." "Good," she said, and that challenging light was back in her eyes. "I would hate to be forgettable." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire die down to embers. And when Caleb finally rolled out his bedroll on the other side of the fire and said goodnight, he lay awake for a long time staring at the stars and wondering if he was making a terrible mistake by leaving. The next morning, Daniel took Caleb into town to meet the cattle buyer, a shrewd older man named Harrison who looked the animals over with a critical eye. After some negotiation, they settled on a price that was more than fair, and Caleb found himself with a decent amount of money in his pocket and no reason to stay. He bought supplies for his journey home, restocked his ammunition, and tried not to think about green eyes and a challenging smile. But when he returned to Daniel's claim to say goodbye, he found Ellie waiting for him by the half-built cabin, and his resolve wavered. "So you are leaving," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Caleb confirmed. "Time to head home before the weather turns." "Of course." Ellie nodded, her face carefully neutral. "Well, thank you again for everything. I hope your cabin is still standing when you get back." "I'm sure it is fine," Caleb said, though he suddenly did not care much about his cabin one way or the other. "Ellie, Do not," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "Do not say something you do not mean. You are a mountain man. You live alone. That is who you are, and I am not going to ask you to change that. We met, you helped me, and now we go our separate ways. That is how life works out here." But as she spoke, Caleb saw the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, saw the way her hands clenched at her sides. She was not as calm as she was pretending to be. She was hurting, and he was the cause of it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This incredible woman who had been through hell and come out stronger, who had challenged him and seen him and made him feel alive for the first time in years, was hurting because of him, because he was too much of a coward to admit what he felt. What did he feel? In that moment, standing in the autumn sunshine with Ellie trying so hard to be brave, Caleb finally understood. He felt everything. Fear and hope and desire and terror all mixed together in a knot in his chest. He had been so focused on protecting himself, on staying safe behind his walls, that he had forgotten what it meant to be fully human, to need someone, to want someone, to love someone. He loved her. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like relief. "Ellie," he said again, and this time when she tried to interrupt, he caught her hands gently in his. "Listen to me. Please." She pressed her lips together and nodded, and he could see the hope flaring in her eyes despite her best efforts to hide it. "I have been lying to myself," Caleb said slowly, working through the words as he found them. "Telling myself I wanted to be alone, that I was happy in my mountains with no one around. But these last 3 days with you have shown me the truth. I was not happy, I was hiding, and I do not want to hide anymore." "What are you saying?" Ellie asked, her voice barely audible. I am saying that the idea of going back to that cabin alone, of spending another winter with no one to talk to, no one to laugh with, no one who sees me the way you do, it makes me feel empty inside. I am saying that somewhere in the last 3 days, you fought your way into my heart, Eleanor Marsh, and I do not think I want you to leave." Tears spilled over onto Ellie's cheeks, but she was smiling too, a brilliant expression of pure joy. "You do not think you want me to leave? That is the best you can do, mountain man?" Despite the seriousness of the moment, Caleb laughed. "All right, how about this? I know I want you to stay. I know that I am falling in love with you, maybe have been since I first saw you tied to that tree, refusing to be beaten. I know that I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to argue with you about poetry and politics. I want to build a life with you, if you will have me." "If I will have you?" Ellie's voice was choked with emotion. "Caleb Stone, I started falling for you the moment you put that knife in my hand and trusted me to use it. Every moment since has just made it worse, or better. I do not even know anymore. All I know is that when you said you were leaving, I felt like my heart was being torn out. Then I am not leaving, Caleb said firmly. Not without you. But your cabin, your life, everything you have built, means nothing if you are not in it, Caleb interrupted. I will stay here. I will help Daniel build his ranch. I will find a new piece of land nearby, whatever it takes to be with you. No, Ellie said, and Caleb felt his heart sink until she continued. I do not want you to give up your mountains for me. I want to see them. I want to see the place that you love, the cabin you built with your own hands. I want to share that life with you if you will let me. It is rough, Caleb warned. Isolated, hard winters and harder work. You would be giving up any chance of a normal life, of society and neighbors, and when have I ever wanted normal? Ellie demanded. I'm a 24-year-old spinster who reads books and has opinions. Normal has never been an option for me. But a life in the mountains with a good man who sees me for who I am, that sounds perfect. What about Daniel? Caleb asked, because he needed to be sure she had thought this through. You came here to help him. And I will, Ellie said. We will, both of us. We will stay through the winter and help him get his cabin finished and his first crops planted. But then, if you still want me, I am yours. If I still want you? Caleb pulled her close, and she came willingly, fitting against his chest like she had always belonged there. Ellie, I will want you every day for the rest of my life. That is a promise. She tilted her face up to his, and he kissed her there in the bright autumn sunshine, a kiss that tasted of salt from her tears and sweetness from her joy. It was not his first kiss, but it felt like it in all the ways that mattered. It felt like beginning. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ellie laughed and wiped at her eyes. Daniel's going to be insufferable about this. He has been hinting since yesterday that I should convince you to stay. Smart kid, Caleb said, grinning. I like him even more now. They told Daniel that evening, and as predicted, he was delighted, crowing about his matchmaking skills until Ellie threw a biscuit at his head. But beneath the teasing, Caleb could see the young man's genuine happiness for his sister and his relief that she would not be alone. The winter that followed was one of the best of Caleb's life. He and Daniel worked together to finish the cabin, adding a second room and a proper fireplace. Caleb taught the younger man how to hunt and trap, how to read the weather and the land. In return, Daniel's easy optimism and constant chatter slowly drew Caleb out of his shell, reminding him how to be part of a family again. But it was Ellie who truly transformed him. She was there every morning when he woke, there every evening when he returned from work. She challenged him when he got too set in his ways, soothed him when old memories troubled his sleep, made him laugh when he took himself too seriously. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, and in the quiet moments they simply existed together in comfortable silence. And every day, Caleb fell more deeply in love with her. They were married in early spring of 1879 by a circuit preacher who came through Red Lodge. It was a simple ceremony, held in Daniel's now-finished cabin with a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Ellie wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Caleb had bought in town, a soft blue that matched the Montana sky. Caleb wore his best clothes and tried not to shake as he slid a simple gold band onto her finger. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Caleb kissed his bride and felt something click into place inside him. He was home, not in a place, but in a person. Eleanor Stone was his home now, and he was hers. They stayed through the spring planting to make sure Daniel was truly established, then loaded a wagon with supplies and headed west into the Bighorn Mountains. It was late May, and the high country was just shaking off winter's grip, the meadows carpeted with wildflowers and the streams running high with snowmelt. Caleb drove the wagon up the old trails he knew so well, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about his years alone in these mountains. Ellie drank it all in, her eyes wide with wonder at the towering peaks and deep forests. When they finally reached his cabin, tucked into a small valley with a clear creek running past and a view of the mountains that took your breath away, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Caleb, it is the most beautiful place I have ever seen." "It is home," he said simply. "Our home now." The cabin was small, just one room with a sleeping loft, but it was solid and well built. Caleb had chinked the logs carefully to keep out the wind, and the fireplace drew well. There was a small barn for the horses and a lean-to for storing wood. It was not much, but it was theirs. Ellie set about making it a home with the same determination she brought to everything else. She sewed curtains for the windows, planted a garden near the creek, organized his chaotic collection of tools and supplies. She learned to handle a rifle with deadly accuracy, to dress game and cure hides, to read the mountain weather as well as Caleb could. She was not playing at frontier life. She was living it, fully and fearlessly. Summer passed in a blur of work and laughter, and long evenings watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and red. Caleb took her to his favorite spots, secret meadows where elk grazed and mountain lakes so clear you could see straight to the bottom. They fished and hunted and gathered berries, laying in supplies for the winter to come. And at night, in their small cabin with the fire crackling and the wind singing through the pines outside, they held each other close and marveled at the life they were building together. "Are you happy?" Ellie asked him one evening in late August as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the stars come out. "Yes," Caleb said without hesitation, "happier than I have ever been. You?" "Incredibly happy," Ellie said, snuggling closer against his side. His arm came around her automatically, holding her safe. "Though I do have one small complaint." "What is that?" Caleb asked, concerned. "You never fight rustlers in the dark anymore," she said with mock seriousness. "I married a man who fought 3 rustlers to save me, and now all he does is chop wood and hunt elk. It is very disappointing." Caleb laughed so hard he nearly fell off the porch. "I am sorry to disappoint you, Mrs. Stone. Would you like me to go find some rustlers to fight?" "No," Ellie said, turning to kiss him softly. "I would much rather you stay right here with me. Besides, you still fight for me every day." "Do I?" Caleb asked, curious. "Of course. You fight against your natural inclination to be alone. You fight to open yourself up to me, to trust me with your heart. You fight to build this life we have together, even when it would be easier to retreat into yourself." She cupped his face in her hands, her green eyes serious in the starlight. "You fight for us, Caleb Stone, every single day, and that means more to me than any battle against rustlers ever could." Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had never been good with words, not like Ellie was, but he tried to put his feelings into language anyway. "You fought your way into my heart, Ellie. Every single day since I met you, you've been fighting to keep me, to make me better, to show me what life could be like if I was brave enough to reach for it. I did not think I deserved happiness, but you proved me wrong. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "Good," Ellie said, her eyes bright with tears. "Because you are stuck with me now, mountain man, for better or worse, remember?" "I remember," Caleb said, and kissed her under the vast Montana sky, surrounded by the mountains he loved and holding the woman who had changed his entire world. Their first winter together was hard but wonderful. The snow piled high around the cabin, sometimes drifting up past the windows, and there were weeks when they could not get down the mountain at all. But Caleb had prepared well, and they had plenty of food and firewood. They spent the long, dark months reading aloud to each other from Ellie's small collection of books, playing cards and talking about their plans for the spring. In late February, during a brief thaw, Caleb made the trip down to Red Lodge to check on Daniel and pick up supplies. He found the young man doing well, having made friends with several other settlers and even courting a girl from town. Daniel sent his love to Ellie and extracted a promise that they would visit once the snow melted. Caleb returned to the cabin laden with supplies and mail, including a letter from Ellie's parents. She read it by the firelight, her face glowing with happiness. Her parents were coming to visit in the summer, wanting to meet Caleb and see their daughter in her new life. She was already planning all the things she wanted to show them, talking a mile a minute about the mountains and the meadows and all the beauty that surrounded them. Caleb watched her, his heart full to bursting, and thanked whatever force in the universe had led those rustlers to steal his cattle. Without that, he never would have ridden into the dark to fight them. He never would have found Ellie tied to that tree, defiant and unbroken. He never would have known what it meant to truly love someone and be loved in return. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the mountains into a riot of green and gold and wildflowers in every color imaginable. Ellie planted her garden again, expanding it to include more vegetables and even some flowers she had bought seeds for in town. She had plans for everything, for chickens and maybe a milk cow, for improving the barn, for all the ways they could make their homestead more self-sufficient. Caleb loved watching her plan and dream. She attacked life with such energy and determination, and it inspired him to do the same. He built her a better work table for her kitchen area, improved the barn's roof, started clearing more land for hay production. They were building something lasting here, something that would endure. In early June, Ellie told him she was pregnant. Caleb had never imagined himself as a father. He had barely imagined himself as a husband until Ellie came into his life. But as he held her close and felt her trembling with joy and a little fear, he knew with absolute certainty that this was right. This was meant to be. They were creating a family, and it was the most terrifying and wonderful thing he could imagine. Are you happy?" Ellie asked, echoing her question from the previous summer. "I know this was not something we planned, but—" "I am thrilled," Caleb interrupted, kissing her soundly. "Ellie, you have given me everything, a home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I could not be happier if I tried." She relaxed against him, laughing through her tears. "Good. Because I am terrified and excited and about 100 other emotions all at once, and I really need you to be the calm one right now." "I can do that," Caleb promised, though internally he was just as terrified as she was. But he would figure it out. They would figure it out together, the same way they figured out everything else. Ellie's parents arrived in July, and Caleb had been nervous about meeting them, worried they would judge his rough mountain life and think he was not good enough for their daughter. But Robert and Margaret Marsh were frontier people themselves, practical and warm, and they took one look at the way their daughter glowed with happiness and accepted Caleb immediately. They stayed for 2 weeks, and Caleb found himself enjoying their company more than he had expected. Robert was a wealth of knowledge about ranching and farming, and he and Caleb spent hours talking about the best ways to manage the land. Margaret doted on Ellie, helping her sew baby clothes and sharing stories about what to expect in the months ahead. When they left to visit Daniel before heading back to Montana, they extracted a promise that Caleb and Ellie would bring the baby to visit once it was old enough to travel. The baby, a boy they named Thomas after Caleb's father, was born in early February of 1880 during one of the worst blizzards Caleb had ever seen. The midwife from Red Lodge could not make it up the mountain, so Caleb delivered his own son with shaking hands and prayers on his lips. Ellie was incredible, strong and fierce even in her pain, and when she finally held their red-faced, squalling son in her arms, Caleb felt something crack open inside him that he had not even known was closed. He had a family, a real, true family of his own. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious little boy who loved the mountains as much as his parents did. By the time he was 2, he was toddling around the cabin and following Caleb everywhere, babbling questions about everything he saw. Caleb found fatherhood suited him, though it was exhausting. He loved teaching his son about the world, showing him how to track animals and identify trees and read the sky for weather. Ellie thrived as a mother, though she made it clear that Thomas would not be an only child if she had anything to say about it. Their daughter Mary was born in 1882, a tiny, fierce thing with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. 2 years after that came another boy, James, who was quiet and thoughtful, even as an infant. The cabin grew to accommodate their expanding family, with Caleb adding 2 more rooms and a proper second story. The homestead grew too, with chickens and a milk cow, and eventually a small herd of cattle. They were not rich by any means, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Daniel visited often, bringing his own growing family. He had married his girl from town, a sweet woman named Sarah, and they had 3 children of their own. The cousins played together in the mountain meadows while the adults talked and laughed and marveled at how their lives had turned out. "Do you remember that night?" Ellie asked Caleb one evening in the summer of 1888. They were sitting on their porch watching their children play by the creek while the sun set behind the mountains. "When you fought those rustlers to get your cattle back?" "I remember," Caleb said, pulling her close. They fit together even better now after 9 years of marriage, their bodies knowing instinctively how to align. "I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I had ever seen, tied to that tree and spitting defiance. I remember thinking you were either the bravest or the stupidest man alive, coming after 3 armed men in the dark all alone, Ellie said with a smile. Took me a few days to figure out which. And what did you decide? Caleb asked, amused. Definitely brave, Ellie said. Though a little stupid too, but in a good way. The kind of stupid that makes a man ride into danger to save someone he does not even know. The kind of stupid that makes him give up his solitary life to take a chance on love. Best stupid decision I ever made, Caleb said, kissing the top of her head. You fought your way into my heart, Eleanor Stone, and you have been fighting to keep it every day since. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is quite a promise, Mountain Man, Ellie said softly. It is not a promise, Caleb corrected. It is a fact. You changed my life, Ellie. You made me believe in happiness again, in family, in a future worth building. Everything good in my life now exists because you were brave enough to fight for me when I was too scared to fight for myself. Ellie turned in his arms and kissed him, deep and sweet, while their children played and the mountains stood eternal around them. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling. We have built a good life, she said. You and me. The best, Caleb agreed, and it all started with 3 rustlers in the dark. And me fighting my way into your heart, Ellie added with a grin. Every single day, Caleb confirmed. Though honestly, you won that fight the moment I saw you. I just did not know it yet. Thomas called for them then, wanting help building a dam in the creek, and they went together to join their children. As Caleb knelt in the cold mountain water, helping his son move rocks while his daughters gathered sticks, and Ellie laughed at their engineering efforts, he thought about the path that had led him here. All the pain and violence and loneliness that had driven him into these mountains in the first place. All the years he had spent alone, convincing himself that was what he wanted. And then 3 rustlers had stolen his cattle, and he had ridden into the dark to get them back. And he had found something infinitely more valuable than livestock. He had found Ellie. He had found love. He had found a reason to live instead of just exist. The years continued to pass in the mountain valley, each season bringing its own rhythms and challenges. Thomas grew tall and strong, helping Caleb with the heavy work around the homestead. Mary proved to have her mother's sharp mind and her father's way with animals. James was quiet but thoughtful, always observing, always learning. When Thomas turned 15 in 1895, he began talking about wanting to see more of the world beyond the mountains. Caleb understood the impulse, had felt it himself at that age, but the thought of his son leaving made his chest tight with a fear he could not quite name. It was Ellie who talked him through it, reminding him that they had raised their children to be independent and brave, and that meant giving them room to find their own paths. We cannot keep them here forever, she said gently one night after Thomas had gone to bed. They need to discover who they are beyond being our children. Just like you needed to discover who you were beyond being a soldier. Just like I needed to discover who I was beyond being a ranch girl who should have been married at 20. I know, Caleb admitted, but I remember what the world is like out there. It is cruel and hard, and I want to protect them from it. You cannot, Ellie said firmly, and you should not. The best thing we can do is give them the tools to face that world with courage and integrity, and then trust that we raised them right. So when Thomas announced he wanted to spend a year working in Billings before deciding whether to come back to the mountains or strike out on his own, Caleb swallowed his fear and gave his blessing. Mary declared she wanted to go to the new teachers' college that had opened in Bozeman, and Caleb supported that too, even though it meant his little girl would be hours away. James, still young at 11, watched his older siblings prepare to leave with wide, thoughtful eyes and said nothing. But Caleb knew his youngest was already thinking about his own future. The house felt empty with Thomas and Mary gone, but they wrote letters regularly, and they came home for holidays and the summers. Thomas eventually decided the city was not for him and returned to the mountains, bringing with him a wife, a practical young woman named Elizabeth, who fell in love with the valley as quickly as she fell in love with Thomas. They built their own cabin nearby, and Caleb helped his son establish his own homestead, passing on all the knowledge he'd accumulated over the years. Mary became a teacher and stayed in Bozeman, marrying a fellow teacher and starting a school for girls who wanted education beyond the basics. She visited when she could, and she always said that everything she knew about being strong and independent She had learned from watching her mother carve out a life in the wilderness without complaint or hesitation. James surprised everyone by developing a talent for drawing and painting. He spent hours sketching the mountains and the wildlife. And when he was 16, a visiting artist saw his work and offered to sponsor his training in Denver. It was the furthest any of their children had gone, and Caleb struggled with letting him leave. But Ellie reminded him again that they had to trust in how they had raised their children. "They are not leaving us," she said. "They are becoming themselves, and they will always come home because we made this a place worth returning to." She was right, as she usually was. All three children remained close to their parents even as they built their own lives. The cabin in the mountain valley became a gathering place for an ever-growing family, with grandchildren running through the meadows where their parents had played, learning to fish in the same creek, climbing the same trees. Caleb and Ellie grew older together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, each shared memory and weathered challenge, adding another layer to the foundation they had built. They had seen hard years and easy years, winters that nearly broke them, and summers that felt like paradise. They had raised 3 children to adulthood, had welcomed in-laws and grandchildren, had carved out a life in the wilderness that was richer and fuller than Caleb had ever dreamed possible. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1909, their children threw them a party at the old cabin. All 3 came with their families, and Daniel and Sarah made the trip from Red Lodge with their own crowd of children and grandchildren. The meadow was full of people laughing and talking and celebrating, and as Caleb stood on his porch watching it all, he felt Ellie slip her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking about a night 31 years ago when I rode into the dark to fight 3 rustlers," Caleb said. "I was angry and determined, and all I wanted was to get my cattle back. I had no idea that night would change my entire life." "Best cattle you ever lost," Ellie said with a smile, the same teasing challenge in her eyes that had been there from the beginning. "Best everything," Caleb agreed, turning to face her fully. She was 70 now, her dark hair completely silver, her face lined with years and weather and laughter. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You fought your way into my heart, Eleanor Stone, and you never stopped fighting. Every single day for 30 years you have chosen me, chosen us, chosen this life. I do not have words for how grateful I am." "You do not need words," Ellie said, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her still strong hands. "You show me every day, in the way you look at me, the way you hold me, the way you built this life for us. You are the love of my life, Caleb Stone, and I would fight my way into your heart all over again if I had to." "You would not have to fight," Caleb said, kissing her gently. "It has been yours since the moment you spat at that rustler's feet. I just did not know it yet." Their children called for them then, wanting to make a toast, and they went to join the celebration. As Caleb stood surrounded by his family, the family that existed because he had been brave enough to ride into the dark and because Ellie had been brave enough to see who he really was beneath the armor, he felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude, seeking escape from a world that had hurt him. But in the end, the mountains had not saved him. Ellie had. Her courage, her determination, her refusal to let him hide from life. She had fought her way into his heart every single day, and in doing so, she had taught him that love was not a weakness to be avoided, but a strength to be embraced. As the sun set over the Bighorn Mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb held his wife close and whispered a prayer of thanks for rustlers and darkness and the incredible woman who had changed everything. Their story had started with violence and fear, but it had become something beautiful, something lasting. It had become love. Years continued to pass in the rhythm of mountain seasons, and Caleb and Ellie settled into the comfortable patterns of their later years. They spent their days tending a smaller garden now, watching grandchildren grow, and enjoying the quiet contentment that came from a life well lived together. Thomas had taken over most of the heavy work on the homestead, and Elizabeth had become like a daughter to them, often sitting with Ellie on the porch while they sowed or shelled peas and talked about everything and nothing. In the summer of 1915, They celebrated their 36th anniversary with just each other, choosing to take a quiet trip to one of their favorite mountain meadows where they had picnicked countless times over the decades. Caleb was 73 now, his body bearing the marks of a lifetime of hard work, but he could still make the hike with Ellie by his side. She was 71, moving slower but still sharp as ever, still quick with a challenge or a laugh. They sat together on a blanket overlooking the valley they had made their home, and Caleb thought about all the years that had brought them to this moment. The fear and pain of his early life seemed like a distant dream now, belonging to someone else entirely. That angry, wounded soldier who had fled to the mountains to hide from the world was gone, replaced by a man who had learned to open his heart and trust in love. "Do you have any regrets?" Ellie asked, as if reading his thoughts. "About how your life turned out?" "None," Caleb said without hesitation. "Well, maybe one." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what is that?" "I regret that I did not find you sooner," Caleb said, pulling her close. "That I wasted so many years alone when I could have been with you." "We found each other when we were meant to," Ellie said wisely. "If we had met earlier, we would have been different people. You needed those years alone to become the man I fell in love with, and I needed my years to become the woman brave enough to fight for you." "Always so wise," Caleb murmured, kissing her temple. "One of us has to be," Ellie teased, and Caleb laughed, the sound rich and genuine. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across the endless blue sky and listening to the wind whisper through the pines. This valley, these mountains, this life they had built together stone by stone and day by day, it was everything Caleb had never known to want. "Tell me again," Ellie said softly, "about the night we met." Caleb smiled. She asked for this story often, especially as the years added distance to the memory. He suspected she wanted to make sure they never forgot where they came from, how they found each other in the darkness. I was tracking rustlers who had stolen my cattle," Caleb began, his voice taking on the cadence of a story told many times. "I followed them for 3 days through the mountains, and when I found their camp, I saw something that made my blood run cold. They had taken a woman captive, tied her to a tree like an animal, but this woman was not cowering or crying. She sat there with her head held high, defiant even in captivity." "I was terrified," Ellie interjected. "I just hid it well." "You were brave," Caleb corrected. "And when I freed you and put my knife in your hand, I knew you were no helpless victim. You were a fighter. And then I went after those rustlers in the dark, and I did not know if I would survive, but I knew I had to try. For the cattle, yes, but also for you. Because no one deserved to be treated the way they were treating you." "And you fought all 3 of them and won," Ellie said, her voice full of pride even after all these years. "I did what needed doing," Caleb said. "And then I met you properly, and you were like no one I had ever encountered, strong and smart and not afraid to challenge me. By the time we reached Red Lodge, I was already falling in love with you, though I was too stubborn to admit it." "You were going to leave me," Ellie reminded him. "Going to ride back to your mountain alone." "The stupidest thing I almost did," Caleb agreed. "But you saw through my walls, saw the man hiding behind all that isolation and fear. And you fought for me, Ellie. You fought your way into my heart, and you have been fighting to keep it every single day since." "Not fighting to keep it," Ellie corrected gently. "Just loving you. Every single day I wake up and choose to love you. That is not a fight. That is a joy." Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even after 36 years, she could still move him to tears with her words. "I love you, Eleanor Stone, more than mountains, more than freedom, more than life itself. You are everything." "And you are my mountain man," Ellie said, settling her head on his shoulder. "The man who fought 3 rustlers in the dark to save me. The man who gave up his solitude to build a family. The man who has loved me faithfully for 36 years and will love me for however many more we have." They stayed in that meadow until the sun was low on the horizon, then made their way slowly back to the cabin where Thomas and Elizabeth had dinner waiting. The grandchildren swarmed them with hugs and questions, and the evening passed in comfortable chaos and laughter. That night, lying in the bed they had shared for over 3 decades, Caleb held Ellie close and listened to her breathing even out into sleep. He thought about that night so long ago, about the scared and angry man he had been, about the 3 rustlers in the dark who had inadvertently given him the greatest gift of his life. He thought about how Ellie had fought her way into his heart and had never stopped fighting, never stopped loving him, never stopped choosing him day after day after day. He had come to the mountains seeking peace, but he had found something infinitely better. He had found home. He had found family. He had found love. And as sleep claimed him, surrounded by the sounds of his family and the house he had built and holding the woman who had saved him from himself, Caleb Stone knew with absolute certainty that his life had been a good one. Not easy, not without pain or struggle, but good, rich, full, worth every single moment. The mountains stood eternal around them, keeping their watch as they had for millions of years and would for millions more. But here in this small cabin in a valley carved by ancient glaciers, a different kind of endurance was being written. The endurance of love freely given and faithfully kept. The endurance of a family built on respect and trust and unwavering commitment. The endurance of two people who had fought their way to each other through darkness and fear and had chosen every single day to keep fighting for each other. Caleb and Ellie lived many more good years in their mountain valley, surrounded by children and grandchildren and the land they loved. They saw the new century bring changes to the world, saw automobiles replace horses in the towns and electricity reach even remote areas. But their valley remained much as it had always been, a pocket of peace and beauty where time moved to older, slower rhythms. When Caleb finally passed away in his sleep at the age of 81 in 1923, he died holding Ellie's hand and surrounded by family. His last words were simple and true. "Thank you for fighting for me." Ellie lived 3 more years, staying in the cabin that Caleb had built, tended by her children and grandchildren who refused to let her be alone. She spent her days telling stories about the man who had fought 3 rustlers in the dark, who had been brave enough to love her, who had built a life that would echo through generations. And when she joined him in 1926, she was laid to rest beside him on a hill overlooking their valley, under the vast Montana sky they had both loved. Their gravestone was simple, carved by their grandson James, who had become a respected artist, Caleb Stone and Eleanor Stone. Together, always. And in the valley below, their great-grandchildren played in the meadows and fished in the creek, and learned about the mountains from their parents and grandparents, carrying forward the legacy of 2 people who had found each other in darkness and built something luminous in the light. The story of the mountain man who fought 3 rustlers in the dark and the woman who fought her way into his heart every single day became family legend, passed down through generations as a reminder that love is worth fighting for, that courage comes in many forms, and that the greatest adventures often begin with a single choice to be brave. And somewhere in the mountains, in a valley where the wind still whispers through the pines and the creek still runs clear and cold, the spirit of that love endures, eternal as the peaks themselves and twice as strong.